Alexandria, 30 BCE. Cleopatra, the last queen of Egypt, does not look like the gilded goddess you've seen in films. There isn't a drop of native Egyptian blood in her veins. She sits at a desk, writing in Greek, her mother tongue. She never spoke the language of the majority she ruled fluently. Around her, advisors speak Greek. In the mirror she sees European features, a descendant of Macedonian conquerors who have ruled Egypt for 3 centuries. This icon of Egypt is, in fact, a foreign monarch, the product of a dynasty that took power by force and never fully assimilated. Hollywood, history textbooks, and souvenir shops sold you a comfortable lie. Cleopatra was not who you think she was. The scene at the top pulls the rug out from under a story many of us grew up with. That glossy, romantic version, the one with dramatic music and a perfect costume, is not what your school lesson paused on. Now, let's rehearse that official story everyone learns. The tidy, seductive myth that makes a compelling poster but a poor history lesson. In the popular imagination, Cleopatra is exotic and elemental, an Egyptian queen who embodies the mystery of the Nile, a seductress with an almost supernatural charisma. She is the woman who beguiled Julius Caesar and later Mark Antony, whose love affairs shaped empires. Her death, the story goes, is a fatal theatrical act, bitten by a venomous asp, choosing pride and mystery over humiliation. This is the version that circulates in classroom slides, in museum gift shops, in blockbuster trailers. Elizabeth Taylor in a gold dress, the cosmetics shelf named after an ancient fantasy. A postcard caption, "Meet the last pharaoh." You learned this image in fragments. A line in a textbook, a movie poster, a staged painting. It's tidy. It gives a hero and a villain, a romance and a moral. It lets you close the book and feel you've understood a civilization through one unforgettable face. That story is useful. It simplifies centuries into a headline. It comforts, it sells tickets, and it hides as much as it reveals. Listen for the voices of the myth. Imagine 3 short lines read in confident tones, the kind that make a history class feel finished. Cleopatra, Queen of Egypt, used her beauty to bend Rome. Her passion ruined Antony and ended a golden age. She preferred death by serpent to the shame of defeat. Those lines sound decisive. They feel complete. They are the neat buttons that close narrative boxes. They do not make space for the messy realities of politics, debt, multilingual courts, international diplomacy, or the hundreds of thousands of lives caught in the crossfire of imperial ambition. Why does that tidy story persist? Because it benefits many players. The travel industry sells the fantasy. An exotic past invites hotel bookings, tours, and themed souvenirs. Hollywood needs an archetype, the alluring, dangerous woman who breaks men and makes drama. Textbooks, often under pressure to condense thousands of years into single chapters, like a clear moral headline. And for centuries, states and churches found the tidy tale useful to teach cautions about sensuality or chaos. Each retelling polishes the myth until the rough edges, the financial crises, the family murders, the literal paperwork of treaties, disappear. We owe it to the viewer to show how comfortable the myth is. Imagine a classroom where a teacher displays an opulent film still and says, "This is Cleopatra." It's satisfying. You nod. The image does not demand further attention. It is an efficient cultural product. Now hear a different tone, the archival whisper. Old coins, fragments of decrees, bureaucratic ledgers, surviving letters. These things are not glamorous. They are granular, procedural, stubbornly dull. And that's precisely why they crack the story. They show language choices, taxation records, and the movement of grain ships. They show a woman who was first and foremost a Hellenistic monarch, trained in the arts of administration and diplomacy, not merely a seductress. Let's lay out the comfortable narrative, in frames, a short sequence of scenes easy to visualize on screen. Frame 1, the romantic painting. Cleopatra reclines, opulent, an object of gaze. Frame 2, the triumphal Roman image. Augustus as liberator of Rome, shielding citizens from Eastern decadence. Frame 3, modern merchandising. Perfumes, spas, and themed cafes minting the ancient into cash. These frames explain the myth's magnetism. They are the stage props for everyone who profits from an image that simplifies history into a moral spectacle. Who gains beyond profit? Empires and ideologues. Octavian, later Augustus, needed an enemy to explain his consolidation of power. Painting Antony as bewitched by a foreign queen served to justify a shift from republic to principate. Poets and propagandists supplied the rhetorical paint, verse and image that drew a clear line between Roman virtue and Eastern seduction. Churches and moralists in later centuries found in Cleopatra a cautionary archetype against pagan excess and female authority. You learn myths because somebody once found them useful for holding power or selling an idea. There are voices that defended the myth as civilizing. Museums and educators sometimes keep the romantic image because it attracts attention and funding. A narrative that brings crowds is hard to dislodge. The myth has habits. It reproduces itself in books, films, and lessons until the original complexity is muffled. Now let us hear from the official narrators, those who framed the tidy story for mass culture. Picture 3 synthetic quotes, smooth and rehearsed. A textbook voice. Cleopatra's allure changed the course of Roman history. A tourist brochure. Experience the magic of Cleopatra's Egypt. A film trailer voiceover. Witness the queen who toppled empires with beauty. These are not lies in the sense of flagrant untruths. They are selections, a reduction of a multifaceted life and time into headline-worthy elements. Selection is the engine of myth-making. You might be thinking, is the romantic picture entirely false? No. Elements of charisma, intelligence, and theater were certainly part of Cleopatra's repertoire. She knew rhetoric, strategy, languages, and the use of spectacle. But the simplified version overweights the theatrical and underweights the administrative. It makes personal seduction the pivot of geostrategy, when in reality, a ledger, a treaty, a naval supply line mattered as much as a dinner. Here is a brief reconstruction of how the official myth evolved through history. Early Roman propaganda, Augustan age, paints Cleopatra as the foreign corrupter and Antony as Achilles undone. Late antiquity through medieval reception moralizes the story, framing Cleopatra as an archetype of dangerous female sovereignty. Renaissance and Baroque periods, dramatists and painters rechristen the story into tragedy and spectacle. 19th century Orientalism, the image morphs with exotic fantasies about the East. 20th century Hollywood, a blockbuster aesthetic cements the visual stereotype. Contemporary tourism and merchandising, the image becomes a brand. Each step refines the myth. Each retelling adds gloss and removes inconvenient facts. That is how history becomes myth. Before we move on to the inconvenient facts, the cracks in this official narrative, a short note about the tone of this next section. You are watching a documentary sequence. Think visual. Faded coins, a scholar's gloved hands lifting a papyrus, a map showing grain routes, a classroom with a projector. The shift will be from glamour to grind. We will begin to pry the myth open. But first, a quick human moment. Thank you for following this investigation this far. If you've stayed with us, you care about history beyond romantic postcards. This channel is small, and every subscription helps us dig deeper into stories that schools compressed. If this video is the kind you want more of, consider subscribing. We're trying to reach 1,000 supporters to keep producing careful, inconvenient episodes like this one. Now the neat story is ready for being tested. The official portrait is appealing. It is also porous. In the next section, we will lay out the first visible fissures: language, lineage, images, and the famous death. These are the small inconsistencies that become impossible to ignore when placed side by side with the myth. A sober question begins to form. If the public image is so tidy, what else has been smoothed away? Hold that question. The next part will put documents, coins, and old writers on the table and make you look closely. The first fissures in the legend emerge like hairline cracks in a fresco you assumed solid. When you step closer, the painted goddess shows brush marks, repairs, and a hidden scaffolding. Narrate apenas the content dentrum, ignore, and I, non-pronounced tags or metadata. Falls sonally the text of narration. For Cleopatra, those cracks are simple: origin, language, image, and the narrative of her death. Each is small enough to pass a glance in a classroom slide, but, taken together, they blow open the tidy story. Start with origin. Cleopatra VII, Philopator, was not Egyptian in the ethnic sense most audiences imagine. She belonged to the Ptolemaic dynasty, Macedonian Greek descendants of one of Alexander the Great's generals. For nearly 300 years, Ptolemaic rulers claimed the Egyptian throne. They adopted Egyptian royal protocols in public, certainly, but they retained Greek aristocratic structures, Greek language, Greek courts, and Greek religion as their core culture. That matters because it reframes Cleopatra not as the culmination of millennia of pharaonic continuity, but as the final act of a foreign monarchy trying to rule a native majority. Think of a map overlay: Macedonia, Alexandria, Memphis, villages along the Nile. Now imagine governance in two languages, with two sets of officials. The ruling culture, its elite schools, its architectural patronage, its administrative language, was often Greek. This is not conspiracy. It is visible in the artifacts. The Rosetta Stone is emblematic, a decree of Ptolemy V set in 3 scripts: hieroglyphic, demotic, and Greek. Its very existence is practical evidence that Greek kings needed to issue edicts in multiple tongues because their primary language was not understood by all their subjects. Cleopatra's significance is precisely that she was the first in her line to learn Egyptian, and even then she learned it as a tool of policy rather than a sign of cultural assimilation. That is a political calculus, not a gesture of being one of the natives. Here's a brief archival scene: an empty official chamber in Alexandria. A scribe copies a decree in Greek. A priest reads the same message aloud in Egyptian to a gathered crowd at a temple. The two performances do not contradict. They show a bicultural administrative reality. Cleopatra navigated that reality with dexterity. She used Egyptian religion as a stage. She posed in the public eye as Isis for ceremonial purposes, but that theatrical fusion does not erase her Hellenistic identity. Next, the image of her beauty. The popular myth says she was irresistible, an almost supernatural figure whose looks shattered resolve. But if you consult contemporary testimony, the picture blurs. The Roman biographer Plutarch, writing roughly a century later, famously remarks that her beauty was not extraordinary in itself. He emphasizes her wit, her voice, and the theatrical presentation she staged. His assessment is telling for 2 reasons. First, Plutarch is not sympathetic to Cleopatra. He is interested in moral lessons and rhetorical portraiture, and yet he does not reduce her to a breathtaking face. Second, other sources that survived through Roman eyes emphasized charm, intelligence, and presence rather than photogenic perfection. We also have material evidence: coin portraits. Coins minted during Cleopatra's reign show a face with a strong profile, a prominent nose, and a robust jawline. These are not the soft, rounded features Hollywood favors. They are the faces of Hellenistic rulers, often idealized, but in a way that meant regal more than seductive. Multi-generational inbreeding within the Ptolemaic line produced recognizable features. The point is not to demean appearance. It is to recalibrate the claim that physical beauty alone toppled Roman statesmen. Plutarch's more plausible explanation is that Cleopatra performed power. She spoke, she staged, she entertained in ways designed to impress political elites. And in that context, presence is more decisive than a static standard of beauty. Another crack, the famous death by asp. The cinematic image is irresistible. A queen choosing the serpent's calm embrace over capture and humiliation. But the biology is awkward. The kind of venom reported in many retellings does not produce a swift, painless exit. Some snakes' venom cause paralysis and respiratory collapse. Others cause intense pain and prolonged distress. Contemporary reports surfaced decades after the event, filtered through Roman commentators who had reason to romanticize or to produce a tidy moral image. Some historians lend weight to the idea of poison taken secretly. Others propose assassination disguised as suicide. The forensic certainty does not exist. This should not make the legend irrelevant. It should make the legend suspect. How did a probable, messy, practical end become a mythic tableau of feminine fatalism? Now note a different contradiction. The public defender of Egypt or the collaborator with Rome? The popular narrative often frames her as the anti-Roman heroine, champion of Egypt against imperial absorption. But the record shows she courted Roman alliance repeatedly, with Julius Caesar, then with Mark Antony. She leveraged Roman power to secure the throne and safeguard Ptolemaic interests. Egypt under Cleopatra was not an isolationist fortress. It was an economic hub. Grain exports, naval logistics, the bank-like operations of Alexandria all tied Egypt to Mediterranean politics. Cleopatra's alliances with Roman leaders were less betrayals and more pragmatic survival moves. She operated inside the Roman system when it was advantageous and outside of it when she could. To call her simply protector of Egypt or traitor to Rome is to flatten a dynamic political strategy into moral binaries. Witness a short, concrete documentary beat. A ledger, worn at the edges, tracking grain shipments from the Nile to Rome. A marginal note, ship chartered under Ptolemaic authorization for corn supply. This is the daily, infrastructural reality that matters more to ordinary people's survival than any romantic tragedy. Cleopatra had to manage famine risks, taxation, soldier pay, court intrigues, and commerce. The romance sells tickets. The supply line pays wages. Another fissure, source asymmetry. Much of what we know about Cleopatra comes through Roman writers, often hostile or partisan. After Octavian's victory, the narrative victors rewrote the story to justify consolidation of power. When a conqueror hands down history, the record tends to favor him. Official documents and Ptolemaic archives were lost, destroyed, or simply ignored. Augustan propaganda, theatrical, literary, and material in coinage and sculpture, cast Cleopatra in the role of the monstrous seductress who corrupted a Roman hero. That portrayal served an immediate political purpose, to make the civil war into a moral caution, and to sanctify Octavian's victory as rescue. Historians must therefore try to reconstruct Cleopatra from fragments. Coins, papyri, archaeological strata, non-Roman inscriptions, and the occasional sympathetic mentions in works that survived despite the political tides. Ask yourself, when history is monopolized by one set of winners, what is the fate of the losers' archives? This is not an abstract worry. It is the practical reason why the myth could be curated, polished, and sold for 2 millennia. The raw materials of Cleopatra's rule, ledgers, decrees, local accounts, were not all preserved in the public narrative that followed. Let the viewer feel the unease. Picture a scene where a scholar toggles between two images on a screen: an Augustan coin lionizing Octavian, and a rust-streaked shipping ledger listing grain consignment. The contrast is jolting. Propaganda on one side, mundane logistics on the other. Which matters more for the people who lived through the years, the banner or the bread? We can group these contradictions in order of impact. Start small: language and identity, Cleopatra's Hellenistic background and strategic use of Egyptian. Move to image: Plutarch's focus on charisma over static beauty, and the numismatic evidence of a resolute profile. Then the death: the probability of poison or murder versus a neat romantic suicide. Finish with motive and policy: the complex relationship with Rome and the pragmatic infrastructure of rule. Each contradiction opens questions that the tidy myth refuses to answer. Why would a sovereign deliberately undermine her own state through romantic folly when she had so much at stake? Why is the story of Cleopatra narrated through the lens of her relationships with Roman men rather than through her economic policies and administrative reforms? The pattern is revealing. The cultural obsession with a woman's sexuality often overwrites her political agency. These fissures are not merely academic nitpicks. They matter because they shape how modern audiences understand female authority, empire, and the politics of storytelling. When you reduce a powerful woman to a cautionary tale about sexuality, you make a cultural shorthand. Female power must be erotically threatening rather than institutionally competent. That shorthand then circulates across centuries, legitimizing gendered assumptions about leadership. The suspicion that grows from these first cracks is not conspiracy, it is pattern recognition. When a story benefits a particular set of institutions, imperial propaganda, religious morals, a global entertainment industry, it gets retold in ways that sustain those institutions' priorities. Cleopatra's myth fits comfortably into formats that need a seductive antagonist. That convenience explains persistence and perversion. By placing coins, papyri, and Roman verses side by side, we begin to reconstruct an alternate picture. Cleopatra as a Hellenistic monarch, fluent in political theater and administrative detail, who used performance when performance served survival, who made alliances as calculus and not romance, whose end was likely messy, practical, and then mythologized by victors. This interrogation of the first fissures ends with a mini cliffhanger. If language, image, biography, and death all bear strains between fact and story, then what happens when we peer further behind the court doors, into the backroom politics, daily governance, and the decisive events that remade the Mediterranean? The next layer will not be about personalities, but about the raw moments that turned Cleopatra into a political actor whose choices had irreversible consequences. Those moments, the alliances, the donations, the battles, will show why the myth had to be invented in the first place. Behind the palace doors, Alexandria smelled of papyrus dust, lamp oil, and boiled lentils. The camera lingers on a narrow room where a scribe copies tax lists in Greek. The ink is still wet when a messenger in the doorway whispers of a grain ship delayed at the Nile mouth. This is the texture of rule: ledgers, shipments, calendar notes, bureaucracy that pays soldiers and keeps people fed. Cleopatra's life, in practice, is this work. You have seen the costume portraits. Now imagine a council table. Men in Hellenistic cloaks point at maps. A naval commander taps a reed on a parchment with fleet dispositions. A treasury official opens a box of silver, counting drachmas, then frowns. Egypt's coffers are thin. Years of loans to Ptolemy XII have left the throne dependent on Roman credit. The state is a balance sheet as much as a throne room. Cleopatra's education paid for that paper. She reads philosophy, but signs edicts. She masters 9 languages, enough to issue decrees in Greek, Aramaic, and, strategically, Egyptian. That last ability, learning the tongue of priests and peasant markets, was less sentimental conversion and more political instrument. She staged herself in public ritual as Isis, because religion was public performance, and public performance secured legitimacy. Scenes of daily rule are not glamorous. There are late nights with scribes correcting tax exemptions. There are farmers demanding relief for flooded fields. There are dockside arguments, chartered ships prioritized for Rome's grain convoys, while Alexandria's granaries wobble. Cleopatra must juggle these demands, pay the garrison, mollify Greek elites, keep temple incomes flowing, and manage foreign debts. Surviving papyri show ration lists, loan terms, and contracts. These are the fragile threads holding a monarchy together. Power in Alexandria depended on networks. The court is a web. Macedonian officers, Greek intellectuals from the museum, Egyptian priests, merchants, and Roman officers quartered in town. Each node has leverage. Cleopatra both relied on and exploited that network. At night, she met with bankers who could float a ship's cargo. At dawn, she conferred with priests who could bless a festival and win popular favor. She traded favors, made appointments, and sometimes ordered removals. Those removals could be brutal. Dynastic politics in the Ptolemaic house resembled family business warfare. Brothers, sisters, half-siblings, many were pawns or adversaries. Cleopatra's rivals were not exotic enemies, but blood relatives who might claim the throne. Arsinoe, once a rival child queen in the earlier civil war, became a public threat. Sources implicate court-sanctioned violence in her end. The court's calculus was hard. Eliminate a claimant now to prevent a civil war that could hand Rome the pretext for intervention. The ethical cost was high. The strategic calculation, in the dynastic view, was simple. When Caesar arrived in Alexandria decades earlier, his intervention had been transactional, military support in exchange for political recognition and loans. Cleopatra knew Rome's men as tools and dangers in equal measure. Her liaison with Caesar produced a son whose existence became a bargaining chip. After Caesar's assassination, alliances shifted from expediency to survival. Antony offered a different bargain, military patronage, a powerful Roman ally who, at least temporarily, operated as a co-ruler in Eastern politics. Watch a quiet, telling image. Cleopatra at a long table, a wax tablet before her, a little figure of a child's name inscribed and circled. She does not act from romantic ardor alone. She weighs dynastic futures, how the child might be leveraged in negotiations with Roman factions. Parenthood here is policy. Lineage is currency. The palace also has a theater mode. Cleopatra understood spectacle. When she sailed to meet Caesar in the Nile, contemporary accounts stress the theatrical. Exotic dress, staged rituals, the queen presenting herself as a living deity. Performance was governance, a language she used to command attention and shape perception. But performance never replaced the ledger. Beneath the silk and incense, men argued about grain quotas and troop pay. Still, in the palace corridors there were mistakes. A delayed shipment, a misread memorandum, a subordinate who misjudged a Roman envoy. Those small errors compounded in a volatile political climate. Alexandria was a node in an empire of supply and credit. When a link broke, consequences rippled far beyond marble walls. There is a quieter side, too, patronage of scholarship. Cleopatra's court maintained ties with the museum and library. Scholars wrote, astronomers observed, physicians prepared remedies. Public benefaction was political. Temples, teachers, and public works tied the ruler to civic pride. But it also mattered. It made Alexandria an intellectual magnet, and gave Cleopatra a cultural legacy that would survive in fragments rather than in triumphant monuments. As these daily pressures accumulated, debt, supply, family rivalries, Roman entanglements, the stage was being set for a dramatic escalation. A ceremony would arrive that turned private calculation into public scandal, and in Rome, a rival would see an opportunity. The slow business of rule was about to meet a spectacle so consequential it would reorder alliances across the Mediterranean. What was read as theater by some and treason by others became, in one gesture, the event that would force the empire's hand. The court's quiet mechanisms, ledgers, letters, loans, propend that gesture forward. And when political theater escalates into geopolitics, history stops being private. The next act would decide whether Alexandria remained a sovereign hub or a prize to be retold by others. The hall is a gymnasium repurposed for ceremony. High columns, benches packed with civic notables, the air heavy with laurel and incense. It is 34 BCE. Cleopatra and Antony sit side by side. He in the regalia of Hellenistic kings, she styled as Isis. The scene is staged to be unignorable. It is, in every sense, a performance designed to reshape the map. On that day, Antony makes proclamations that appear to distribute Roman eastern provinces to Cleopatra's children. Zarion is declared King of Kings. Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene are assigned territories. The list reads like a Hellenistic brochure of dynastic ambition. To Antony and the Alexandrian court, this solemn ceremony rewrites authority in the East, a new dynastic axis, a Hellenistic confederation under Antony's military patronage and Cleopatra's administrative center. In Rome, the message could not be more explosive. Octavian seizes on it with a strategist's timing. He frames the ceremony as betrayal, a Roman general surrendering Roman provinces to a foreign queen. The optics are irresistible. The Roman Republic has long feared the specter of monarchic kings. Antony handing out kingdoms to foreign children plays neatly into the old Roman anxiety about monarchy and foreign subversion. The donations are not just diplomatic miscalculation, they are a narrative grenade. Octavian's propaganda machine, already active, repurposes the event into a moral indictment. Antony becomes not a statesman with Eastern interests, but a Roman consumed by foreign decadence and a queen's seduction. Roman citizens, many distant from Eastern realities, are given a binary tale. Antony corrupted, Octavian the defender. The Senate senses opportunity. The Republic's old institutions, fraying under civil wars, rally to a cause that cloaks ambition in virtue. On the ground in Alexandria, Cleopatra watches the fallout, letters, courier messengers, the slow spread of fear and rumor. Antony confers with his officers. His resources are substantial, Eastern legions, fleets, client kings, but his political capital in Rome is evaporating. The gulf between Antony's Eastern project and Rome's sensibilities is widening by the day. The strategic misreadings pile up. Antony assumes that public displays of Eastern legitimacy will cement an imperial reality. Octavian assumes he can package Antony's actions into a referendum of Roman virtue. Both miscalculate the volatility of narrative. In the Mediterranean, legitimacy is as much about perceived moral posture as it is about ships or gold. Then comes Actium. The naval confrontation is the crescendo of months of maneuver, propaganda, and broken alliances. The Mediterranean is a chessboard where galleys are pieces and supply lines are lifelines. Octavian's admiral Agrippa has cornered Antony and Cleopatra's fleet off the coast of western Greece. The battle is messy, sun-blinded, with sails collapsing and oars splintering, a chaos that films later romanticize, but which contemporaries described as brutal, noisy, and fatal for thousands. Antony's fleet is routed. The retreat to Alexandria is humiliating, but tactically intended as a regroup. Yet return means exposure. Octavian follows, diplomacy collapses, and the narrative of Roman salvation hardens. Rome needs a closure that justifies the civil war's blood. Cleopatra and Antony, cornered, retreat into the final act of their lives. The end in Alexandria is cinematic and disputed in sources. Antony, misinformed and despairing, falls on his sword. Wounded, he dies in Cleopatra's arms, according to the story crafted by Roman historians. Cleopatra's death, so central to myth, becomes a tableau for centuries, the queen choosing venom rather than capture. Contemporary accounts disagree on the method: asp, poison, staged murder. What matters less is the biological fact than the story Octavian's Rome allowed to survive: a queen choosing death with theatrical finality. Why the dramatics? Because a neat ending suits a neat story. For Octavian, the deaths of Antony and Cleopatra tidy up political irregularities and hand him the moral right to reshape the Mediterranean order into an imperial system. For the Roman writers who inherit the narrative, the image of a seductive foreign queen seducing Roman virtue serves as a moral lesson, both sensational and useful. But look again at the aftermath. Egypt is annexed. Its bureaucracy is reorganized into provincial structures that feed Rome. The library's fragments survive in scholars' notes, but the Ptolemaic archives, the local decrees that might have told another tale, are dispersed or destroyed. Octavian's victory establishes the Principate. The veneer of republican institutions remains, but power concentrates. The political architecture of Rome is transformed, and with it, the lens through which future generations view Cleopatra. That transformation was not accidental. The donations provided Octavian with a narrative to justify sweeping constitutional change. The military victory provided the means. The deaths of Antony and Cleopatra supplied the moral tidy-up. A republic that had soldiered through decades of internal war now accepted a single ruler who marketed stability. The historical ledger closed in favor of one dominant voice. On the streets of Alexandria, the people felt immediate changes: levies, new procurators, shifts in taxation policy. For ordinary farmers and sailors, the clash between elite narratives meant hunger, new overseers, and an abrupt reorientation of trade flows. Great drama at the top cascaded downward into the humdrum but brutal reality of occupation and administrative overhaul. And yet the story told from Rome would not mention the contracts, the tax schedules, the grain ledgers that mattered to those people. It would show a queen as exotic other and a general as a cautionary example. That version stuck because it served a new master, an emperor who needed a myth to cement his legitimacy. This is the dark core. A political event in a decorated hall ripples out into conquest, institutional transformation, and a cultural master narrative that endures. The donations are more than a scandal. They are an inflection point where policy, image, and ambition collide, and where story-making becomes conquest. What follows from here is not merely political administration, but a long campaign of narrative purification. The next scene is Octavian's careful curation. Poems, coins, laws, and fires that decide which archives survive and which do not. The machinery of meaning will grind with as much force as the Roman galleys once did on Actium. After the conquest, Rome took more than territory. It took the story. Octavian, now Augustus, understood that victory becomes permanent only when the memory of the defeated is shaped to fit the victor's needs. The propaganda machine was not one monolithic engine, but an ecosystem. Poets, sculptors, mint-masters, magistrates, and priests working in concert to produce an account that justified the new order. Imagine a minting house. Slaves and artisans strike coins overnight. Octavian's face appears on the obverse with an inscription that frames him as restorer of peace. On the reverse, scenes of triumphed victory and piggish vanquished icons. Money is daily politics. It travels further and faster than any speech. It is an efficient medium for rewriting prestige. Parallel to coins, the pens of poets sharpened the narrative. Virgil's Aeneid, written under Augustan patronage, turns Roman civil war into destiny. Horace's odes celebrate a revived Rome under a morally approved leader. In their verses, Antony becomes an instrument of fate undone by foreign seduction. Cleopatra slides into mythic sensuality. Poetry idealizes the political rationale of conquest and implants it deep in Roman education. These poems become primers for the elite, and the elite becomes the axis along which layer curricula spin. Sculpture and public art followed. Statues of the emperor proliferated. Reliefs depicted Augustus as deliverer. Meanwhile, images of Antony and Cleopatra were recast as warnings. The barbarian East suggests spectacle over disciplined governance. Public spaces were curated to reflect the ideological shift. Temples repaired in Roman style. Public texts recited that emphasized Octavian's pietas and the dangers of irrational passion in politics. Equally cutting was archival violence. After the sack of a city or a palace, documents are not always burned for convenience. They are selected, preserved, or destroyed with intent. Augustan officials allowed certain records to survive that confirmed the imposed narrative. Others, inconvenient to the new order, vanished. The Ptolemaic administrative records, the local decrees that could nuance Cleopatra's rule, receded into disappearance. That absence matters. Silence is a method of historiography. Religious and moral reframing followed the political. As Rome shifted from pagan pluralism toward an imperial cult, and later to Christianity, Cleopatra's image flexed accordingly. In Christian moral imagination, she could be a symbol of pagan decadence. In medieval sermons, her story served as a caution against licentious rulers and foreign temptations. Each era retooled her image to suit its anxieties. The Renaissance rescued pieces of the classical past, but often repurposed them for new narratives of drama and romance. Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra is hardly an objective history. It is a dramatic meditation that cements the tragic couple as lovers above politicians. That artistic fascination, now filtered through European sensibilities, boosted one side of the story, the romantic, and obscured the administrative and geopolitical realities that were originally decisive. The 19th century's Orientalism recolored Cleopatra with exotic fantasies, sensual fabrics, harem fantasies, and the West's appetite for the mysterious East. Paintings, novels, and operas embraced this image. Tourism, another layer, began to commodify a fantasy of Egypt. When visitors file through museums or stand beside pyramids, guides stitch together a continuous antiquity that bridges pharaohs and Ptolemies into one pleasant, marketable narrative. The stakes here are economic. A marketable Cleopatra sells postcards. Then came cinema, Hollywood's gilded lens that fused these threads into a global visual stereotype. A costly film in the 1960s with Elizabeth Taylor did more than entertain. It cemented a version of Cleopatra for the television age. Costumes, close-ups, a manufactured accent, all combine into an image that is visually irresistible and thus durable. Filmic representation is a vector of myth. The camera chooses which face survives. What did all this do to historical truth? It did not so much erase facts as reorder priorities. It elevated narrative hooks, seduction, exoticism, tragic romance, over administrative detail, economic policy, or the pragmatic necessities of rule. It made Cleopatra into a symbol easier to digest than the complex reality of a Hellenistic monarch balancing grain quotas, naval logistics, and Roman factionalism. Important surviving sources are largely Roman and post-conquest. The irony is that the best preserved accounts come from those with reason to craft a villain. Historians must triangulate from fragments, coins, papyri, inscriptions, and the occasional foreign witness. The method is forensic. Piece together administrative records and financial notes to see a ruler acting less as a mythical seductress and more as a pragmatic state manager. You saw the ledgers, the grain contracts, the decrees. Now place them against the spectacle. Which mattered more to the common people, a queen's stagecraft or the arrival of grain? The answer is blunt. bread over theater. But theater bought time and attention in elite circles. It influenced allies and rivals alike. Cleopatra knew performance's value, and she used it as any smart ruler would. Modern echoes show how durable such manufactured images can be. When modern leaders are accused of being seduced by foreign powers, when female politicians are boxed into sexualized narratives, the rhetorical machinery is ancient. Cleopatra's myth surfaces as shorthand in debates about gender, leadership, and foreign policy. The weaponization of a woman's image to delegitimize her political acts is a long, unattractive lineage. So who manufactured the enduring Cleopatra? It was a long chain of actors: Augustan poets and coiners, medieval sermons, Renaissance dramatists, Orientalists, filmmakers, and marketers, each pruning and grafting the queen's image to fit their own cultural needs. The process was cumulative and opportunistic. Each retelling made the image more resonant, more sellable, and more difficult to dislodge. At the end of this long edit, what remains? Not a single unassailable truth, but a layered artifact. The queen as ruler, the queen as spectacle, the queen as caution, the queen as fantasy. Reconstructing the real Cleopatra means excavating these layers, acknowledging what is probable, what is disputed, and what is obviously shaped by victors. There is a final, unsettling arithmetic. Stories that suit power are repeated. Repetition becomes truth. The machinery that turned an Eastern queen into a Western moral image still hums today. Different faces, same mechanism. That realization should make us suspicious of our simplest historical certainties. The next step is not to exonerate or demonize, but to present a more honest portrait, complex, morally tangled, and politically consequential. Pull aside the props, look at the accounts and ledgers, weigh the motives and constraints. Only then can we start to understand what Cleopatra actually tried to do, and why her story was, and remains, so useful to those who tell it. When you strip away the lacquered legend and the stage props, Cleopatra emerges less as the impossible goddess of postcards and more as a calculating heir of a Hellenistic dynasty, an operator who understood symbols, currency, and the arithmetic of survival. Look at the images she left behind: coins, busts, inscriptions. They do not show the cinematic Cleopatra. They show a Macedonian royal profile, a strong nose, a square jaw, a ruler who chose to be represented in a way that linked her to a lineage of kings rather than to an invented exoticism. That visual truth matters because rulers choose their faces when they want to make a lasting argument. Cleopatra's choice was an argument in political identity, not in erotic myth. Her education was deliberate and deep. She read in the libraries, argued with scholars, spoke a range of languages as tools of governance. Those are not the details of a romance. They are the toolkit of a Hellenistic monarch trying to run a collapsing treasury and a vulnerable economy. You have to picture Alexandria not as a romantic backdrop, but as a fiscal nerve center: granaries, tax ledgers, ship manifests. When corn shipments were late, people murmured in the marketplaces. When coinage was light, scribes worried in dim rooms. Cleopatra's interventions, grain contracts, tax remission, patronage of engineers, were practical responses to structural fragility. She used patronage as leverage, and performance as leverage too. Stagecraft was part of statecraft. Her relationships with Rome's greatest men must be viewed through that same pragmatic lens. With Caesar, a child was born who became a political chess piece. With Antony, alliances tried to bind enormous Roman military power to Alexandrian economic capacity. These were alliances of interest. They contained personal layers, certainly, ambition, proximity, maybe affection. But those human elements were subordinate to the calculation: how to secure Egypt's autonomy and the Ptolemaic throne. That calculation led her to open courts, to keenly stage rituals, and to hand out titles in grand ceremonies. When Antony agreed to the donations of Alexandria, he performed an institutional sleight of hand that elevated Cleopatra's family in a manner meant to create a Hellenistic bulwark in the East. The gesture was political theater made into policy. Yet the portrait is not a flattering absolution. Cleopatra practiced ruthless politics. In palace corridors where sibling rivalry was lethal, order was maintained by removal as often as by reconciliation. The killing of potential rivals, the exile or disappearance of inconvenient relatives, these were not anomalies but features of dynastic rule. To govern a fractious polity was, in their world, to neutralize threats before they metastasized. Historians debate the details and the responsibility, but the pattern is consistent with Hellenistic realpolitik. The dynastic family was both the instrument of legitimacy and the locus of perennial danger. She was also an innovator in propaganda. Think again of coins and inscriptions. They were small, portable arguments that traveled with merchants and soldiers farther than any oration. By controlling the image on coinage and sponsoring monuments that blended Egyptian ritual forms with Greek dedicatory language, Cleopatra constructed a hybrid legitimacy. She presented herself to Egyptians as an incarnate goddess within their religious idiom, and to Greeks and Romans as a dynastic queen within a Hellenistic cultural frame. This was a balancing act meant to keep multiple constituencies aligned under one crown. It was shrewd. It was, at times, cynical. There is a moral complexity here. Cleopatra's policies often benefited Alexandria's elite classes and the city's scientific and cultural institutions. She patronized the library scholars, she maintained the docks, and she protected trade. Those acts underwrote the city's prosperity and, tangibly, the grain flows that fed Rome. Simultaneously, her choices deepened inequality and consolidated power into a tightened palace apparatus. You can admire her as a protector of learning while criticizing the mechanisms she used to secure resources. To simplify her into either saint or seductress erases this entwined truth. Crucially, her ambition had strategic logic but obvious limits. The Hellenistic world she sought to restore, an integrated Eastern polity centered on Alexandria, was a project of courage and hubris. Rome's republican and military structures were not a loose collection to be reassembled into a Hellenistic federation at the pleasure of two allies. Antony's allegiance to Cleopatra bound him territorially and symbolically to an Eastern axis that Rome's domestic politics could not accept. The strategic miscalculation was mutual. Cleopatra misread Rome's capacity for propaganda and internal repression. Antony misread his domestic political standing and the fragility of his image back home. Even when you strip away the myths, some parts remain uncertain. The exact circumstances of her death, the precise motives behind each palace execution, the private tenor of her relationships, these are hazy. Sources are uneven, and many documents that could have weighted the scale differently are gone, lost in fire, obliterated in the purge that followed Actium. Where evidence is thin, the honest historian must say, probable, plausible, contested. The reconstruction that stands on firmer ground is clear enough to dislodge the neon-lit myth, but not so absolute as to turn Cleopatra into a single, untouchable figure of moral judgment. So here is the reconstructed portrait, a Macedonian-educated queen who used culture, language, performance, and marriage as tools of statecraft, a patron of learning and protector of economic lifelines, a ruthless dynast who tolerated and sometimes ordered political violence, an ambitious strategist who tried to rebalance Mediterranean power in Alexandria's favor, and misread a political climate increasingly hostile to any alternative to Roman hegemony. She was therefore neither merely a romantic villain nor a heroic liberator, but a complex actor in an era of collapsing polities and emergent empires. And if you felt until now certain about the shape of this story, about who is the betrayer and who the betrayed, bear in mind that certainty was the luxury of the winners. The more you press at documents and coin hoards and grain ledgers, the more you find real politic and human ambiguity crowding the stage where legends like to act. There is a final twist. The real Cleopatra never fully controlled how she would be remembered. That, perhaps, is the most tragic part of her portrait. The person making last efforts at statecraft could not direct the historical editing that followed. The next act in her life's narrative, the one that erases complexity and writes moral tidy-ups, belongs to other hands. And it is those hands that we will examine next. You will see how a political victory became a cultural erasure, and why the story you think you know was not merely told, but actively made. The story does not end with Actium. It metastasizes into images, poems, coins, schoolbooks, and films. The annexation of Egypt was efficient in registers of administration and ruthless in registers of memory. When Octavian marched into Alexandria, he collected not only chests of gold, but the narrative threads that would be woven into imperial legitimacy. The machinery that retooled Cleopatra's image into a cautionary figure was a coordinated, multi-decade enterprise, legal, religious, cultural, and economic. To understand the modern echo of that effort, follow the vectors of memory. First, the official instruments. Coins were reissued not merely as currency, but as statements of restored order. Obverses with a triumphal Augustus, reverses with spoils and subjugated icons. Public ritual changed. Temples were rededicated. Ceremonies of Roman piety amplified. And inscriptions that once recorded Ptolemaic decrees disappeared from public view. Administrative purges are less spectacular than a burning of scrolls in an epic film, but they are more durable. Officials who wrote provincial accounts, judged disputes, archived decrees, many were replaced, retired, or co-opted. The practical result was a shift in the documentary corpus. What survived to be read by later ages came from the offices of those who legitimized the new order. Second, poets and artists, the cultural engine. Augustus patronized poets who could fuse his political program into mythic patterns. Virgil, Horace, Ovid, in different tones and registers, crafted narratives that made civil war legible as divine destiny. In those narratives, Antonius was not primarily a Roman general. He was a man undone by foreign seduction. Cleopatra's portrayal was transformed into a literary archetype. Enchanting, ruinous, an exemplum of what happens when private desires govern public duties. Art and literature are not incidental. They are tools that translate power into the language of meaning. Their echoes last because they migrate into education and ritual. Third, the slow archival curation, selection by omission. Documents that would have complicated the official tale were neglected or destroyed. Those that affirmed it were recopied and taught. This archival decision-making is not always an act of malevolence. It is a governance choice. Which records stabilize the new regime? Which are nuisances to be buried? The effect, however, is historiographical. Centuries later, the surviving voice is disproportionately the victor's. This is why the Ptolemaic administrative minutiae, tax receipts, municipal decrees, local petitions are fragmentary. The absence of voices is itself historical data. It reveals who gained the power to define what counts as history. Fourth, religion and moralization. As Rome evolved, especially under Christianity, Cleopatra's figure migrated from a political mimesis into a moral parable. In sermons, in hagiographies, her image served as example. Pagan vice versus Christian virtue. The moral register simplified complexities into binaries. Order versus chaos, chastity versus corruption. Medieval retellings used her not to teach about Hellenistic statecraft, but to caution against female sexual power and foreign influence. These reframings reshaped the symbolic currency through which later generations judged ancient politics. Then the Renaissance and the theater repackaged the mythology into art. Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra is a masterpiece, but it is a play, not a history. It recasts political catastrophe into tragic romance. That artistic power is not innocent in its effect. A dramatic rendering becomes a cultural heuristic. When paint and stage and verse fix an image, it moves easily into popular consciousness. Orientalist fervor in the 19th century then amplified eroticized, exoticized tropes, lavish fabrics, harems, mysterious East fantasies, further distancing public imagination from archival evidence. By the time modern cinema arrives, a visual shorthand is in place. Cleopatra must look and act a certain way for audiences to recognize the trope.
Narrate only the content d'entrée. Ignore and not pronounce tags or metadata. Fall solely the text of narration. Hollywood's version, big budget, vivid, and emotionally persuasive, sealed many of these images for a global audience. Film is faster and more implacable than a poem or a coin. A costume and a camera close-up can make a feeling universal. The 1963 studio spectacle that cast Cleopatra as an alluring, exotic empress did more than entertain. It etched a silhouette into worldwide popular memory. That silhouette was not the only story available, but it was the most easily consumed. Film reaches millions in a way that an academic monograph never will. Meanwhile, tourist economies convert those images into commodities. Hotels, package tours, postcards, all sell the neat myth because it performs better in the marketplace than complexity does. What does this multiplicity of vectors produce? A cultural shorthand that collapses nuance. The shorthand serves many interests: national myths, commercial profit, pedagogical simplicity, ideological comfort. It also helps perpetuate certain social patterns. The image of a politically active woman sexualized into a cautionary tale feeds contemporary gendered tropes. Women in power suspected of being seductive rather than decisive. Their political moves explained by libido rather than strategy. When you call a female politician a Cleopatra in a modern debate, you are not being historically descriptive. You are tapping into centuries of rhetorical reworking designed to delegitimize female agency by sexualizing it. That shorthand is durable because it is useful. It is an efficient narrative. It explains complex events with simple moral architecture. Victors sell the architecture because it masks messy compromises and makes legality appear natural. Once a story is embedded in an empire's rituals, its durability increases. Law, poetry, art, and money reinforce it reflexively. But the distortion also has consequences we can measure in present-day debates. Foreign influence accusations against women leaders, the caricature of Oriental decadence used to justify intervention, the rhetorical templates of ancient propagandists echo in modern speeches about security and loyalty. Tourism ministries that brand attractions with the sexy cinematic Cleopatra reap immediate gain, while erasing competing local histories. Film and gaming industries that recycle the image make it viral again. And each repetition makes dismantling that myth harder. This is not to say all retellings are cynical manipulations. Some artists and writers have sought to recover complexity, different voices reclaiming a damaged subject for nuanced purposes. Feminist scholars, post-colonial critics, and historians armed with new papyrological evidence have begun to reconstruct a fuller portrait. Their work is painstaking because it must unpick centuries of sedimented myth. Yet these recoveries matter. They restore the procedural, the administrative, the political, the things that affected people's lives in concrete ways, not just the theatrical moments that make a good set piece. So the hidden legacy of Cleopatra is double-edged. Politically, she became a convenient enemy,
Culturally, she became an alluring label. Both functions have continued to shape how we think about power, gender, and foreignness. When a single story is useful to successive regimes and markets, it is selectively preserved. The task now is to recognize which parts of the story are evidence and which are performance, and to ask, persistently, who benefits from the version we accept without question? You can start to answer that by asking where the ledgers are and why they were allowed to vanish. And that question takes us to the final move. What should replace the myth on the public mantelpiece? The answer matters because myths, once enshrined, are hard to dislodge, and they do real harm when they become templates for contemporary politics. The next short section will ask the basic but devastating question that should unsettle every comfortable history class and every dramatized epic alike. We walked from a staged throne room to granaries and ledgers, from love scenes on stage to selections in state archives. The path is clear. Power not only wins battles, it decides which documents live and which truths die. If the image of Cleopatra was so thoroughly remade to serve Augustus's political needs, what other figures have been similarly edited to comfort winners and marketeers? You learned a tidy legend in class. You saw a gilded romance on screen. Now ask yourself, who wrote the version you call history, and who profited from erasing the inconvenient records? If even Cleopatra can be turned into a myth that suits power, how many other simple stories are really careful, purposeful edits of a more complicated past? Thanks for watching this investigation. If you want more cases like this, hidden archives, myths unstitched, stories that the classroom omitted, subscribe and tell us where you learned the versions you now question. Leave a comment with your city. Let's map who's asking the hard questions. There are more dossiers to open. Cleopatra is only the first.